Dear students, hope you all are doing good. Welcome to another very exciting session of the course Mechanical Characterization and Modeling of Tissues. So far we had been talking about the different ethical regulations or practices, what is considered to be an ethical way of conducting research, what are some of the unethical way of conducting research in order to understand the importance of ethics. So ethics in testing with soft tissues, this is what we are primarily focused on, where you have to have ethical clearances and make sure the ethics committee guidelines and norms are met, right? So we are going to just continue with the discussion and try to learn a little bit more about ethics, how things have evolved over time, because this is a very important aspect when you're trying to work with soft tissues, right? So let's get started. Okay, so fundamentally, research ethics are basically, we had defined ethics earlier, but we are now going into the research ethics. It's a way of conducting the research enterprise, such as the three fundamental principles of research, which includes respect, beneficiary or beneficence, and justice are upheld, right? So research has to show, along with whatever it does, a sense of respect, beneficence, like, so there is a greater good to the community and to the general public as well, as a whole, and it does justice to what is being done, right? So all these three things have to be upheld while we are considering research ethics. Ethical research must conform with national and international accord and prescripts, right? Like, so if we are trying to let's say talk about soft tissue testing in the US versus in India, the rules and regulations may be slightly different, the regulatory bodies may be different. So we have to kind of upheld all those standards which are at least there in the law of the land, which is, let's say I'm conducting research in India, so it has to uphold all the ethical practices of India. And if I'm trying to basically extend or extrapolate any of these results to things happening in the US, or apply this to some medical devices and other practices, then I'll have to uphold the ethics in that country as well, right? So this should conform with all those national and international norms which are required. Okay, so here are a few principles of research ethics, the three which we have just highlighted. We want to dig a little bit deeper into all these three. So starting with respect, I think respect from research participants. So this is the first one out underneath the topic respect, right? Which includes an informed consent. So research participants, like I said in the earlier lecture, needs to be totally aware of what your research techniques are, what is the background, and what you're going to do with the research data, and exactly how you're going to implement this in some public community research or whatever you're trying to do, right? So they should be on the same page as the researcher. You should never withhold information or tell them some flowery story and do something else with their data. That is completely unethical. So in order to facilitate that, you want to make sure they have an informed consent. So if you're trying to draw blood out of somebody and do a few tests, they should know clearly what is to be done with that blood. Or take a piece of tissue, they should know what is to be done, and then they should be able to give you an informed consent. Otherwise you're just somehow taking a consent, which is not correct, right? So next is respect for sponsors of research. This is another very important aspect. So many a times what happens, is a funding agency which will give certain amount of funds for certain research, and then it doesn't have the time or basically the visibility to look at what is going on inside that research lab, right? So we should show some respect to the sponsors, the funders of the research as well, and take them in the same page where we are with the research. We should never do like two experiments or claim five experiments were done. These kind of practices should not be followed, right? Next is respect for communities where participants come from, right? So this is very important. So if you're trying to look at, let's say, a general healthy population, and you're trying to compare some of the results of a research with diabetic population. So they are coming from a diabetic community, or in certain cases they could be of certain classes of people or different kind of categories. It could be disease specific, or it could be class specific, or it could be you're trying to understand the difference divide of some healthcare aspects between the rural and the urban community and things like that. Should always show mutual respect to all these folks, right? Like while doing that. So should never call a person who is if you're doing an obesity study, call a person fat, like for example. You could always call them that we are looking into the BMI and trying to understand the measurements and things like that. So but any kind of derogatory terms or things which can diminish their respect should not be used. If you're working with urban and rural communities, they should be given equal opportunities. You should not be like serving you know refreshments for the others and not taking care of the other half because just they have come from a background which is a little underprivileged background. So those things have to be taken into consideration while conducting research. Every subject should be treated as equal, right? Next is respect for knowledge and academic community, right? So there should be certain amount of respect for the academic community and knowledge in general. So we should never perform research which questions the science in a way where it cannot be justified, number one. And then it should not create some kind of ruckus in the academic community, right? Like where we're trying to prove something against what the academic beliefs are and things like that. So there has to be some level of respect while we are doing that, right? So we have to make sure that if we are doing animal studies, they have to go by the right channel and procedures. It should not be that I make a few calls and bypass few of these aspects because I'm a well-known researcher versus somebody who is a less well-known researcher. So these kind of things should be as much as possible avoided, and you'll be very surprised to believe this is highly prevalent, right? So as new age researchers or new folks who are going to possibly get into industrial or academic research, we should be mindful of all these, right? Next is we are talking about beneficence. Beneficence, which means the researcher is responsible for the mental, physical, and social well-being of the participant throughout the participation in the study, right? So we have to make sure, and I would like to add to this, it's not only during the participation in the study, you have to make sure that none of the research aspects affect the participants who are taking part, right? So it should not be like you're doing some kind of vibration analysis on a person and this person experiences a back pain for 20 days or 30 days, and then you are like, I don't take responsibility. That should not be the way to go, right? You should clearly tell them that these are some possible causes. If they're still willing to participate, great, but otherwise you should be mindful of what their experiences could be. It could damage them mentally in certain cases, right? So we may reveal certain things in the research which they do not want to hear, right? It may damage them physically. In certain cases, you make them do exercises or certain physiological parameters are measured which causes them to go through some physical exertion, right? Like those kind of things should be highly avoided, right? You want to make sure that these are clearly outlined. There are research statements and problems which people work on, where there could be some possible mental, physical, or social well-being issues, and they're very very critical research, and they are usually approved by the very very higher authorities. I've seen such researches being conducted in the US universities. I'm sure there are similar ones in the Indian context as well, but they have to have all the approvals and a very clear consenting process and whatnot, right? So under the beneficence, a few of the things which are important. First is benefits must be weighed against potential risk that a person might have by participating, right? So we should always not look at research benefits or benefits of publishing a paper and then we have a 4 or 5 amputees come and have like in a very unhospitable environment, you test them or things happen or they hurt themselves. These kind of things are not correct just to generate data or do certain things, right? Like that has to be done with potential risks of what that person may go through has to be weighed against the benefits, right? That's how the judgments or decisions have to be made, right? Next is research should only be justified if it is its conduct and results will be of benefit to the participants, right? So this is one of the standard statement. If you think that certain research can harm a participant, that kind of research should not be conducted through an ethical process or which considers an ethical process, right? So that kind of research is not of any value to the public, right? So let's say you want to test certain drugs, which as a fact can harm them. So those kind of drugs should not be tested. Or if you want to take a sample of tissue which as a fact that can cause them very bad kind of infection or can deteriorate their conditions, those kind of things should not be done, right? So but having said that, these are very often done, right? And typically with a lot of underprivileged people and sometimes in the rural community and places like that, a lot of folks from the small clinics and things like that who are trying to conduct research may sometimes go completely unethical. So these kind of things have to be totally condemned. If you ever find about all these things, you should totally report it to the authorities or things like that, right? So it should be always for the benefit of the public. That's the tagline. If anything is going to harm anybody, you place an implant in the eye and it can have a 50% chance of recovering or doing damage to the eye, you should not do that research, right? If it is a 95% proven chance or something where you're trying to better the life of somebody who cannot see, let's say there is a glaucoma condition where you're trying to use a valve which can potentially improvise her condition, his or her condition, but will not harm anyway, yes, go ahead with that research. But if you're trying to use it on a healthy participant, that's tricky because that can deteriorate their conditions, right? So this thing has to be very much kept in the mind while conducting research, right? Next is how the community will benefit should be clear from the research protocol. So in the research protocol or the participant information sheet, we should clearly lay out what should be the community benefit and the overall benefit. So if I'm testing a set of diabetic population, right, like participants on with a pressure measurement insole, I should clearly say it out loud that based on this data, we'll be able to figure out that what are the thresholds beyond which you can possibly get a diabetic ulcer, for example. So this is the benefit to the community. So if I conduct this research, maybe a year or two, I should be able to come up with certain algorithms along with this insole, which allows us to detect any sort of diabetic ulceration possibilities and prevent such incidences in the near future. That's going to benefit the participants and the community at large, right? So that's of importance. Next is justice. So researchers should not place one group of people at risk solely for the benefit of another, right? This is where this is also a very tricky point because again you can watch a lot of movies around it. Like one of the series which I pointed out is Humans, where I've seen it in Hotstar. It might be fiction part of it, but those things do happen, right? Like where there are certain tissue tests or pharmaceutical or drug trials in certain very underprivileged people. This is happening not only in India, all across the different countries, right? Like and that's why the ethical norms and things have been empowered, like, and they have been enforced over time. And I'm going to take a few examples in today's lecture how many of the unethical practices have been stopped, and that's how many of the laws have come along in the direction of ethics, right? So that is to be considered while deciding on your research work, right? So risk and benefits should be distributed in an equitable manner when recruiting participants, right? So it should not be that I'm conducting a test with healthy and diabetic population, it's going to harm the diabetic population, it's no big deal, they're already harmed. These kind of thought process should never be there. It should always be like, can I do something for the benefit of them and something in a very comforting setting so that none of their things are harmed. I'm treating the normal population and the diabetic population equally. Of course, equal is not possible because this is a diseased population versus a healthy population. So that's where the term equitable comes, right? equity or equitable term basically means that in healthy population, if I'm doing certain arrangements that they're just walking in and maybe sitting somewhere on a chair, and just like they're able to sit there for hours or get certain refreshments. For diabetic population, I may have to have a nurse or somebody like who is just assisting them during their research time or participation time, just that extra help to make sure these things are equitable, because it's a disease population, needs certain help, right? So this is how respect, beneficence, and justice has have to be implied, like into all the different forms of research which we conduct, with not only with soft tissues, with the human population at large. And these are all important principles of the research ethics, right? Next, let's look into difference between clinical and social science research in terms of the different activities. Just a perspective to look at, right? So from a definition standpoint, a clinical research is defined as a research study intended to test safety, quality, effectiveness of new or existing old medicines, medical devices, and or treatment options using human participants. That's what a clinical research actually means. When you have involvement of human participants, not always the case. You may have animal models and higher different kinds of smaller and lower and higher animal models. Those are also part of clinical research, but typically they're focused on the human participants, right? Where you're trying to look at the safety standards of a drug or a medical device or any procedure and things like that, right? Next is social science research. By definition, is a systematic recording and analysis of data that may lead to generalizable principles and theories, resulting in prediction and possible management of behavior and events in society. So, social science research is more focused towards what could be the possible behavior of this particular community or this disease population. Based on that, we can predict on what kind of products have to be offered, what kind of services have to be offered, and things like that, right? Uh, Clinical research from a research activity standpoint includes invasive and non-invasive procedures, right? That may include surgical interventions, removal of body tissues or fluids, administration of chemical substances, observation, administration of questions, right? Like, so a lot of things may happen from an invasive and non-invasive nature, right? And soft tissue also becomes part of a clinical research, right? Like whenever you're talking about soft tissue from a cadaver or a live human person, where you're trying to, let's say, test a drug or test a certain kind of biosensor or whatever you're trying to do which has a touch with the skin or some component of the human body, any kind of wearable technologies have to go through as a part of clinical research, right? As opposed to that, social science research basically reviews the literature, reviews data, interviews, focus groups, observations, looks at case studies, administration of surveys, and tests are done to understand a broader perspective on certain ideas. It could be, for example, mental health issues during the pandemic. That's a social science research, right? You want to roll out surveys and look at certain communities. It could be folks from the school or folks from the colleges, engineering colleges, management colleges. You can categorize what are the mental health conditions overall based on, let's say, 50 questions or 100 questions. That's the kind of social science research where you miss or you do not have a direct interaction with the participants, right? So that's the difference between a clinical research where you have direct interaction with the participants in invasive and non-invasive ways, right? So that's the distinction we need to understand. So whenever you're conducting surveys, it's not a clinical research; it's more of a social science research, right? So many of us may wonder that do I need an ethical clearance or do I need not an ethical clearance? These kind of questions may be there. You do need an ethical clearance for anything dealing with the public, right? But clinical research is treated in a very different way from social science research, right? So phases of the steps to be followed. Clinical research typically has 4 phases, and social science research has more or less 8 phases depending on research questions and design of the study, right? So that's a clear demarcation. Further into these two differences, right? Like clinical trials and the social research have these different phases. So clinical trials, under that you have phase 1, where a new drug, vaccine, or medical device is tested in a small group of healthy persons from the very first time, right? for the very first time. The aim is to determine the general safety, the correct dosage, and negative effects. So a lot of the research is could be hit and trial as well, that you want to administer, let's say, 2 milligrams of this particular dosage of medicine, which has been newly developed and have been tested on animal models, or you've done other in vitro studies. So you're trying to test it for the very first time on the human population and trying to get the dosage correct by testing it on batches of 10 people each, right? Like in one group it's showing huge amount of improvements in the conditions which they had, or it's acting as a placebo. So these kind of things are looked into while doing clinical trials. Similar, if you want to suture a certain area with a certain kind of new bandage which you have developed, you want to look at the healing capabilities or how quickly it is to heal. That's where the soft tissue application is, right? So next phase is typically in the clinical trials. Clinical trials, a new drug, vaccine, or medicine in a larger group. So you start with a smaller group, which is typically known as a pilot study, followed by a larger group where you're looking at several hundred people. So the first phase is typically where you're looking at, in certain cases, even 5 or 10 people. In most other cases where you have healthy population, 10, 20, or 30 or more, right? In cases where you have typically very niche areas, like a person who is an amputee of a certain type, very difficult to find for research, there you may get away with 4 or 5 subjects, right? So that's typically the selection of the subjects. There is usually a person, statistician, who looks at what should be the right selection, what are the numbers which are needed to produce the right full statistical results. So these kind of things are looked into. Then once you're done with phase 2, where there are several of 100 people, then phase 3 is testing on several thousands of people, where you're going outside the communities and trying to look at the much more diverse population, and how the particular drug or new surgical technique or a tissue extraction technique or things like that are working out right there. So then phase 4 is clinical trials done to several thousand people after the new drug, vaccine, or medical drug has been registered or licensed for sale by the Medical Control Council. So up till phase 3, everything is happening before you have all the key licenses to market the product, where it is open to the public, general public, right? So phase 4 is done once it is open to the general public. Now many of the hospitals and other places have already started adopting them, and you can conduct a much more larger span of trials to just make sure things are as effective as you saw in those 100 or 1000 people, right? And what is the rationale for increasing the numbers? Because this is how you can look at different diverse conditions, like everybody has like a different body weight, body composition, BMI, and things like that. And how this particular technique, surgical technique, or drug administration technique is working across this diverse population. Somebody may be from Kashmir, somebody is from the south of India, right? Somebody is from Kolkata, like, so how are these people like responding to this particular administration of the drugs or medical devices, right? So this is what is looked upon like in phase 4. If you compare this with social science research, you see a very different problem formulation. So you're basically looking at a phase 1 where there is problem identification, problem definition, right? And then basically you are looking at development of a theoretical framework. So theoretical framework is where you devise a lot of questions and how the hypothesis is, what you would like to hear, what you can, what are some of the potential hearing options and things like that, and how you want to interact with the public in terms of survey questions. Because in majority of the surveys, you are not interacting directly with the participants, so you may have to put certain options in which they may take, and there could be a few subjective questions and whatnot, right? So the then you have the hypothesis formulation, like I said, and followed by the research design, data collection, and data analysis, right? Like once you've collected data of 300 participants who have completed a survey on a certain so and so disease or some kind of condition, healthcare condition, you can then basically analyze those data and come with important facts and figures, right? So one of the example is like we recently did a survey, and you can look up my profile and just look up one of those papers. It's on basically we have did a big survey on how the different kinds of insoles are adopted by people, like with different levels of plantar pain, like foot pain, right? So what is their level of comfort? There were plenty of questions and questionnaires which gets them through the level of comfort. What are their challenges? What are the key feedbacks and things like that? So all those things were collected as a part of a research work, right? It's a survey based research work, pretty wide survey, and based on that we got some very valuable information, and data analysis revealed a lot of important facts and figures which are useful for the community at large. There is, for example, if a particular type of insole is not benefiting, for example, anybody with the plantar foot condition, then that kind of insole should not be used. So these kind of facts and figures comes out of these social science research, right? Which you may not be able to do with a clinical research on 10 people. You will not be able to conclude facts out of that, right? So that's how a social science research differs, and it has its last phase, which is phase 8, which includes the report writing and dissemination of findings through publications or any kind of literature review, right? So this demarcation between a clinical trial and the different phases of the clinical trial and phases of the social science research, which could be healthcare social science research, has to be understood like very clearly. So next question, and kind of coming back to the crux of ethics, why would you be concerned, or why be concerned with research ethics? What is this ultimately going to lead to? So first of all, research ethics you have to be concerned with, because of we all have a professional responsibility when we conduct healthcare research to avoid reputational damage. We do not want to do some unethical type of research which somehow finds a data which is desirable by the society and things like that, and something leaks out. Things do leak out. It's a generation of social media, right? Like so. And there could always be data breaches if the public faces some challenges. Let's say there is a certain medical device which we had a very nice kind of marketing campaign and everything for that, and a person dies with that medical device administration, then you will have a very very bad reputation. You maybe as a doctor put in jail, right? Like just because of doing something which is not ethically done properly, right? So to avoid reputational damage, third is research can be harmful to participants, to researchers, to institutions, right? And to research communities at large. So if you do certain types of unethical researches, like it can harm the participants in a shorter or longer run. Several things administered to the participants could be carcinogenic and things like that. To the researchers, it just creates a wrong notion or wrong technique of doing things. It's just like stealing stuff. Like when you start stealing, it's you have successfully done that once or twice, and then you're happy that third time I can do it right. So it creates a very wrong research practice and wrong value system in the research, right? Like if ethics is not followed. Third is to the institutions. If something comes out that there was some wrong set of clinical trials or something which was done, and which has been badly done, and that has affected like 10-15 people or so forth, it creates a huge reputation damage to the institute as well. Like nobody would like to come to those institutes like for studying or partner with such institutes and whatnot, right? To research communities where certain unethical researchers could be published, and they could be highly cited and things like that, and then if the research community finds out that this was not done properly, it damages the research community and the basic uh, you know uh, passion for research. So that's why always research ethics have to be upheld. Fourth, and this is to avoid litigation. In a scenario where a proposal is classified as ethics category 1, such as exempt from ethics and biosafety research committee review, liability and responsibility arising from decision based on ethics are to be shouldered by the FRC and its members. That's the research community and research committee and its members, right? Like So many a times, many of the institutions, many of the researchers, just to cut corners or avoid the time delay, would somehow package or showcase a research as if this doesn't have any ethical consideration, this is all good to go. That is a very thin line. When those kind of activities are performed, if something goes wrong, then you are totally responsible and you could be liable for litigation, extreme damage in terms of legal hassles and things like that, where you can get into. I'll take you an example. There is a hernial mesh device which is basically implanted for correction of hernia. There are similar transgenital devices which are used for diseases like pelvic organ prolapse in the female. So these devices, if you just look them up, you will see a lot of litigations and lawsuits all across the internet. That's because many of these devices or these are basically meshes which are kind of like soft tissue mimics and things like that. They have not been tested correctly, and many of them have been marketed pretty well and implanted on patients who have suffered quite bad catastrophic failures, and through a lot of trauma they have gone through, right? Similar with hip implants. So many of the hip implants, even though the marketing department of an institute or company is marketing them very well, they may fail, and they do fail. Also with the cardiac stents. So if you have ever experienced somebody in your family have a cardiac stent through angioplasty, you will basically experience there are different sizes and choices of cardiac stents, right? Like choices would usually differ from, let's say, 20,000, 40,000, 1.5 lakh, 3 lakhs. So what are the key differences in these stents? Many of them are very substandard quality. It is always not necessary that the cheapest is the substandard quality. Even the expensive ones could be substandard. It's just probably just marketed with a nice company's face, right? Another very key example which all of us can relate to is during the pandemic. If you look at the pandemic, and there was a huge requirement for masks, all of a sudden in the country there was a mask shortage, and everybody jumped into this mask and sanitizer making business, right? Like every other business was doing that. And if you look at that, we have tested quite a few masks, and many of these cloth based masks are not as effective, right? They cannot even prevent yourself like from common viruses or bacterial conditions. So you're looking at COVID-19, which is a very specific size of the virus, right? So they are unscientific, but they have been marketed very well. And very sorry to say, but like a lot of the very reputed clothing companies started marketing these masks, and people are questioning an N95 or something like, for which got fairly popular at a certain point, for maybe 9500 rupees, and they're buying these expensive masks for 1000 rupees, right? Like just because it's branded from a company. And but these are all locally made, and then they have been branded. So many a times there could be a nice face or brand associated with certain goods, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've been ethically properly processed in terms of healthcare norms and everything, right? Like, so this is just to be mindful of with these examples. Let's go further. So let's look at the evolution of research ethics next, the codes and regulations, and let's look a little bit into the international landscape. So back in the day, we started with the Berlin Code, and whenever typically an ethical guideline has been imposed or enforced, typically and very unfortunately, it has been marked with certain happenings which has caused those ethical guidelines to be enforced, right? Like some ethical practices have been conducted all across somewhere in the globe, which has caused these ethical practices to evolve. So the Berlin Code in 1900, where much emphasis on beneficence and autonomy was basically enforced. The guidelines for human experimentation, 1931, were developed, so quite a while ago, focusing on therapeutic and non-therapeutic informed consent. So this was the first time informed consent, this term, was introduced. Before that, many of the experiments were not done without consent, right? Uh, Nuremberg Code, this is 1947, another very big event. Then Declaration of Helsinki. Helsinki is a place in Finland. 1964. The Belmont report in 1978. We are going to take a little bit of glimpse into all of these. Then we have Council of International Organizations for Medical Sciences, CIOMS guidelines, which was implemented in 1982. Then you have the International Conference on Harmonization, where all the ethics and laws and practices, so that they can transcend the boundaries. If you remember the 1990s, that's when we were talking about globalization. Things were opening up, the countries were opening up, goods and services were exchanged, and there's a lot of harmony between the countries. Before that, things were much more confined to certain countries, right? So that's where harmonization of, if I'm going to sell a medical device from India, make it here, sell it in the US, how do I harmonize the policies so that the right ethical guidelines are followed in both countries, right? Like, so things like that. So this is how the different codes and practices of ethics have evolved, right? So let's take a very quick look into all these specific pointers in the history. So the Nuremberg trial 1947, this is precursor to Nuremberg ethics, research ethics code being developed. So 23 people were tried, 20 doctors and 3 administrators, right? 7 were sentenced to death by hanging, 9 were given prison terms, and 7 were found not guilty, right? So this is a source where you can look more into the Nuremberg trial, what actually happened there, right? So basically, the judgment by the War Crimes Tribunal at the Nuremberg, Germany, laid down the standards due to this Nuremberg incidents, to which physicians must conform to when carrying out experiments on human subjects, right? Key principles in the Nuremberg Code included voluntary consent of the human subject, right? This is very important. Capacity to consent. So you should not be like, there is a particular person who is diseased, who cannot speak, write, talk, see, or any of these particularly, and you're asking them for a consent, and you're just assuming that you have their consent. They should have the capacity to consent, or there should be a immediate guardian who is ready to consent on behalf of them, right? Freedom of coercion and an understanding of risks and benefits involved. So nobody should be forced into doing some kind of clinical or being a clinical participant, and this is surprisingly very much done in all across the world, unfortunately, where certain people who are not able to earn their living, they're offered money in you know with respect to clinical trial participation and things like that, and they are not aware of the consequences and things like that, and this is very unfortunate. So this is how things should not be conducted. And freedom to bring the experiment to an end, right? Like, so these were the key principles of the Nuremberg Code. Minimization of risk and harm was emphasized on, and the science and design of the study must yield fruitful outcomes. This was also a point of concern. Okay, next was Declaration of Helsinki, which is one of the primary events. We are going to not talk about all of the ones which we have just pointed out. So 1964 adopted the world by the World Medical Association. 10 out of 12 research ethics research markers from the Nuremberg codes were adopted. So many of the newer policies which have evolved over time have adopted things from the previous policies and have updated it with new policy terms which they found as useful, which were still getting violated after implementation of the previous norms, and how things can be improvised. That's the key idea. The central point in the Department of Health is the DOH is the principle that well-being of the participant should take precedence over the interests of science. So as per the Declaration of Helsinki, this was laid out that well-being of a participant should be taking a higher precedence over the interests of science. So this is very, very important, right? First revision to the this Declaration of Helsinki was adopted in Tokyo in 1975. The revised DOH was drafted by 3 Scandinavian professors of medicine. The key additions was the requirement that independent committees review research protocols, right? Like, that's very important. Informed consent requirements were simplified for non-therapeutic research, right? for therapeutic research, informed consent was much more complex, so they were simplified for non-therapeutic research, where it's not going to harm your body. Like for example, you're wearing a wearable technology or wearing a biosensor. You may have a level of discomfort during the voluntary participation, but it will not going to is not going to have any harmful effect on your body per se, right? So this document was elaborated of the kind of an elaboration of the 1964 version, right? Like, so this is just a picture of with a specific citation of the photo where of Tokyo, I believe, where this first revision of DOH was adopted, right? The second revision to the DOH was adopted. This is all the Declaration of the Helsinki, which was modified in two or three versions. In Venice in 1983, a minor revision was made to the document adopted in Tokyo in 1975. For example, the word doctor was changed to physician. So certain terms were kind of modified, and they have changed over years, right? Like, so for example, a lecturer may be known as a professor in India. So or a particular type of professor might be equivalent to something else like in a different country. So these kind of terminology changes were adopted with not much of change in the revision conducted in Venice in 1983. Then there was a third revision which DOH adopted in Hong Kong in 1989. uh, there was a key addition to the document having a requirement to submit the protocol to a specially appointed committee independent of the researcher. So this was a huge leap. So if you look at most of the ethics committees like these days in the institutions, they are having medical doctors, they are having administrators, but they are not having the principal investigator. For example, if I'm going to conduct or propose a research, I'm not part of that committee, right? So they are able to take an independent decision uh, which is not influenced by my way of working, right? Next, the Belmont report, which was an outcome of the Tuskegee D or Tuskegee G case specifically. There was as a result of this case, where this is kind of an insider's account of a shocking medical experiment conducted by the government doctors against African American men. So this was the Tuskegee syphilis study, right? Back in the day, syphilis was very it was more of a like a pandemic, right? Like, and then epidemic per se. And then this particular study was conducted in underprivileged African American men in a totally unethical norm, and this came to light, and that's where the Tuskegee case was highlighted, and it became a huge national news. And the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was established for the very first time. So a lot of these cases, like I've indicated, have led to development of the right ethical practices or the established committees and the departments. So the report sets forth the principle underlying ethically acceptable conduct of research involving human participants. Report is also the basis for the US federal regulation governing research. So that's also very important. The Belmont report emphasizes on the principle of respect, justice, and beneficence. So this could be very well related to what we are observing right now. So the Belmont report had a huge impact on how we see ethics committee rules or regulations these days, right? So the Council for International Organization for Medical Science, CIOMS guidelines 1982. The CIOMS was established in 1949 by WHO and the UNESCO, mainly to serve the scientific interest of the biomedical community. In 1982, CIOMS issued the International Guidelines, quote unquote, for biomedical research involving human subjects to guide the implementation of the Declaration of Helsinki, right? The original document had 15 guidelines and has been revised twice in 2012 and now has 21 guidelines. So these are absolutely mandatory guidelines besides other guidelines which may be specific to certain countries and states, right? The topics in CIOMS guidelines include ethical justification and scientific validity of biomedical research, including human subjects. So now you are being asked for certain justifications while you're trying to do any kind of human subject research. You cannot just show up one day and say, let me test something in the blood, let me test something on the foot, let me test something on the hand, and conduct some research just to produce some data or publication. So as per this rule guidelines set by the CIOMS, you should have a clear justification and scientific validity, like of that this is a scientific way of conducting research on the human subjects to the committee before you can actually conduct that research. How this is enforced is a different question altogether. That depends on the kind of community and people you're looking at in certain committees, but uh, by the heart of it, like that was kind of enforced that this needs to be followed. Next is informed consent has to be part of it, like which is very clear. Standards for external review. So it should be that whenever an ethics committee decision or ethics proposal is being floated for certain research, they should follow certain standards which can go through in an external review also. It should not be like in a small clinic or an institution, they want to conduct a lot of biomedical research and human subject research. They make their own committee of friends and somehow pass all the ethical rules and guidelines through it and get the research done. No, that should not be the case. It should be following some standards, which if goes for an external review should also follow those standards, should not bypass any of those things, right? Research in communities with limited resource, this is another important part. So for places where you have limited resources, you should be able to conduct research there, clinical research there also, uh, with these laws and guidelines. So that is how the CIOMS guidelines were developed, right? Next, this is another very important event, which is around the 1990s International Conference on the Harmonization, ICH. ICH brought together the regulatory authorities and the pharmaceutical industry of Europe, Japan, and the US in 1990. The key objectives of ICH is to harmonize the manner in which medicines and drugs are developed and registered, right? In 1996, ICH finalized the guidelines for good clinical practice, GCP. This is often observed if you're trying to do some high level clinical research. These GCP guidelines are intended to provide standards for ethical and scientific quality for developing, conducting, and recording of clinical trials, right? WHO, which is the World Health Organization, which is an observer status in the ICH steering committee, published a handbook of good clinical research practice in 2006, right? So they are more of an observer and they can intervene if absolutely required. Otherwise, they are okay with the ICH steering committee, because many of the committee members may be similar, right? So they did publish a book. Now with this handbook, you can follow these orders like all across different nations and states, right? With a good clinical research practice, which was published in 2006, right? To help researchers implement the GCP or the good clinical practice standards all across the globe. Next is informed consent. So informed consent is a very important point. This is a consent given by definition by well-informed potential participants about the nature of the research procedure, scientific purpose, and who knows about the risks and benefits of the study, right? This is considered to be informed consent. It is given without subjecting the potential participant to coercion, intimidation, or undue influence. So if you scare a particular participant, and this happens, right? Like many of the times a doctor who is not ethical may tell to a participant that if you do not do this procedure or do not take this test, this may have some huge problems with your health, right? If you say these kind of things, that is totally unethical. You have to go with the scientific practices, what should be the common or the correct method to do this and things, and coercion, intimidation, or undue influence should not be the part of that, while getting informed consent to test certain human tests related to tissues or drugs or particular medical devices, right? Participants' understanding of the research aim and objectives must be addressed by laying out the details out in the language that the participant understands in a culturally acceptable way. So it should not be right that I make a one pager document on the participation information sheet in English, and I give this to certain underprivileged or let's say illiterate people, or people who are comfortable talking in a different language. Maybe they talk in Hindi, or they have their regional language like Punjabi, Gujarati, or let's say any particular South Indian, Malayali. Or it could be that it's a different foreign language and you're trying to get a consent from them in a different language. That should not be the case. They should be well aware of how things are. Like, so if you're in a Chinese university, they should give you something in English, right? It should not be like a Chinese rule book and you're signing off on that, right? So that thing has to be made sure, like while taking informed consent. As a principal investigator who runs the show in a project which has human subject participants or subject tests involved, they are kind of whole and solely responsible for making sure of all this, right? So what are the stages and processes for informed consent? So let's look at some of the stages and their informed consent activities which follow. So before the commencement of the study, you have to assess the local culture. You should be able to identify the risks and benefits before and after the study, right? This should be well defined. It should not be like, oh, let us do the study and we'll find out if something goes wrong. It should never be the case. As a researcher, I should be well aware of what are the risks and potential possibilities of harm to the participants which may occur, and I should be very clear with that. And before before the commencement of the study, there should be some pilot testing. Pilot testing is like, let's say I want to test a particular insole which I've developed on 20 participant. Before doing that, let me wear it myself, or let my students wear it. That way I've done some initial pilot test to make sure that this is scientific, this is not causing any harm, and is conforming to the basic principles of the ethics, right? So this is to be done before the commencement of the study, where informed consent is to be obtained. We have to figure all these things as part of the activities. Next is, at the beginning of the study, information should be presented with the aid of support material to enhance understanding of the research aims and objectives. So it should not be like, oh, you come here, I'll give you a brief for 1 or 2 minutes and let's just jump into the research, right? And you'll be very surprised, this is very commonly done by researchers across the globe. They do not want to reveal too much information about what is going on. That is not a correct notion, right? We should be conversant with them. We should allow them to ask questions, have them ask questions and clarify things, and we should clarify them properly rather than withholding information, right? So at the beginning of study, we should also tell them about the risks and benefits of the study in a proper presentation way, right? Like, so for example, if I do slip and fall studies with human subjects, for example, I should tell them that if you fall down, you're going to break your foot, or there would be a harness system to protect you when you fall down, right? So there should be some potential risks which are highlighted and how I'm planning to mitigate those risks. These all things will also be asked when you're pitching to the community, pitching to the ethical community or the ethics community of your institute, trying to get an ethical clearance for a particular test or particular human subject study, right? And the same has to be kind of relayed on to the participants. Understanding is assessed, so you have to make sure that the participants are well aware of what they're going to go through. It should never be done in a hurry. Many a times they may themselves say, oh, please, I trust you, please start, get started. That should never be the case. Tell them very clearly that this is what the repercussions are, these are what the challenges are, these are the good and bad things. And still, do you feel like after this discussion you're okay to go with the informed consent? If it is a no, then it is a no. So we'll have to be very careful and mindful of that, right? And during the study, you should reinforce key ethical principles and also address issues of concerns. So if a participant is facing any kind of discomfort, or they are not able to perform certain tasks and things like that, that should be clearly resolved with the participants rather than having them just drag it, right? So what are the key elements of informed consent? It includes the description of research aims and objectives. That's very important. Description of potential risks, description of expected benefits, right? Which the participants may gain out of this, because why are they wasting their time for like 1 hour? They are probably doing this for some benefit which they can have from this research. Otherwise, there are a lot of studies. I've seen this in the US. I'm sure a lot of other countries do that similarly. You'll get paid hourly for your service as a volunteer, right? And I've not seen that in Indian context per se, but I'm sure like there might be institutes who are doing that. But we have to kind of justify ourselves that this volunteer is coming all the way down to be a part of a research study. What benefits are they getting out of it? At least some research benefits should come out, right? So explanation of confidentiality and anonymity of the participants. So we have to be completely anonymous and maintain the confidentiality. Their data should not be leaked or discussed with any other fellow principal investigators and other people outside your research group, right? Explanation of participants' rights, including the fact that participant participation is completely voluntary. So this kind of mention has to be there every now and then, that participation is completely voluntary. If at any part during the test, subject test, if you feel like you want to withdraw from the study, please feel free to by telling us why you would like to do that and things like that. So it should be a clear thing that this is totally voluntary. They should not feel any levels of discomfort. We should also explain the issues relating to remuneration and compensation for injuries. What if this person injures their foot? Do we just leave them like that, that this we have already told you this is not our responsibility? No, that's completely unethical. We have to self assess from a research standpoint that what all are the things which can go wrong and how am I going to compensate them for that. Have a game plan and plan for that, right? So finally, what members of the research ethics committee look for in your research proposal? Just a quick snapshot. So what they checked for respect and dignity of the participants. How they check it? They look for appropriate information to participants in a form, in form of the participant information sheet, and language they will understand. So some cases where you may have participants who just speak or understand Hindi, it should be translated in both Hindi and English, right? Next, they will check that there is a fair and humane way by which consent will be obtained, right? Third is they check the type and nature of questions that participants will be required to respond to. Some of these questions may be extremely sensitive, right? Or can affect their mental health. You should always avoid those questions. Check if the questions are culturally correct. So, are we saying the culturally right things? So, sometimes you may say something vulgar or like say some things like which are not culturally acceptable, like in to majorly the male or female population, or it could be a population which is either male or female. So those kind of things have to be looked upon and sensitive to the value systems of the participants, right? So that is very important. They also check that the rights of the vulnerable persons are protected, such as like the underprivileged people and other folks. So for example, this is a South African regulation with respect to vulnerable participants are complied with. This is an example, right? Next is privacy and confidentiality. Check for a declaration. So these ethics committee folks are going to check for declaration that guarantees protection of the participants' privacy and confidentiality. Just us telling it verbally, it is not going to work. How are we going to maintain it? What are our ways? Are we randomizing the data sets, or what all are the key activities and steps which we are following? Stating those are very important. Last is favorable balance of benefits and risk. Are the benefits and risks weighed right? So these are the third thing. So under this, they are going to basically check for if the proposal has outlined potential harm, if it is clearly laid out, physiologically, legally, or economically, and measures that will be taken to ameliorate potential risks are legit and justified, right? Check whether the direct benefit of the research has been made, the research is going to make is being known, right? Like, so what are the research benefits? What are the research challenges or possible risks? They have to be weighed in order for the ethics committee to approve your proposal when you're going for that, right? So few other things, I am just going to skip over some of the key details of it, like एक दो मिनट है अच्छा ठीक just एक second. Okay. So few of the things which I'm going to talk about here are fair subject and community selection. So research must not exclude a class of people who are likely to benefit from research participation, or in whom the results of a specific kind of research are likely to be applied. So it should not be a specific kind of that I know that these results are going to look very skewed and favorable for my research, so I just take these kind of participants. It should be a diverse and fair community. The sampling plan of the research project must be checked for fair subject selection, right? So many a times we do unfair practices, right? Like we select certain subjects who are surely going to give us the results which we expect. That is what the ethics committee is going to look into. Professional competence and sufficient capacity. A principal investigator, according to the GCP or SA, carries primary responsibility for securing participants' safety and well-being during the study. So these things have to be looked upon. Coercion, undue pressure, and conflict of interest. A researcher under this must disclose the source and extent of funding to the research participants. Where is this? So let's say the study is funded by ICMR or is funded by the SCRB or some bigger private institutions, and things have to be clearly laid out. Commercial affiliations or financial interests at the time of proposing and reporting the research must be disclosed. It should not be for making personal gains. This is not how research should be conducted. Research involving minors and vulnerable persons have to be looked at with a point of criticality. The research, as per the ethics guidelines, and the researcher should demonstrate an awareness for applicable national and international laws, regulations, and codes, such as Act number 38 of 2005. This is one example of South African Children Act. There are similar acts in the country which have to be clearly complied with, and the ethics committee will make sure that this person knows about these acts and policies and have laid out as a annexure or something to the proposal. Then only they may grant the ethics clearance, right? So this is the final one: how to submit a proposal for ethical clearance. The proposal submitted for ethical approval should demonstrate that by each of the following ethical aspects are not only addressed but discussed in logical and cogent fashion: respect and dignity of participants, privacy and confidentiality, balance of benefits and risks. So you can take some notes here. These are to be sure check marks. Sampling plan, fair participant selection. This is the summary of things. Competence and capacity of the researcher. If this researcher is just has done one study and that is not human subject, so what is the competence of that researcher? They may ask a doctor to be involved or some other co-principal investigators to be involved. Those things can happen, right? The last one is protocols and procedures followed in dealing with minors and vulnerable persons should be well known. So these are some of the very important guidelines for formulating your ethical clearance proposal, which you're going to be using for all your soft tissue testing research, medical device testing research, which involves some components of the soft tissues, right? So hopefully this ethical clearance guidelines and how things have evolved, what are the good and bad practices, are to be kept in mind while considering or taking the next steps to work towards your research problem, right? So we are going to continue on more exciting topics, so stay tuned. We'll see you again shortly. Thank you.